Welcome back to the Bees Like That podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chris. I thought that since I neglected to record and upload step 2 in my 12 weeks of AA podcast series, that I would just double up and record step 3 and submit that before the week is over. So here we go. Step 3, made a decision to turn our lives and our will over to the care of God as we understood him. So just right off the bat, for me and always, and I think I can't be alone in this, but for me, step 2 and 3 are somewhat synonymous, and there's a ton of overlap. I think step 2 is more about radical acceptance. Step 3 is more about acceptance in action, right? But anyway, we're going to go through it. Starting with surrender and trust. Step 3 is about letting go of the need to control everything in your life and trusting that a higher power can help guide you. The step asks individuals to accept that their own will has led them to destructive behaviors, that true recovery comes from turning over control. I talked about this at length while going over step 2 and what that means to me, or what that has meant to me in my recovery. And as I've just said, there's a ton of overlap here, so we're not going to spend too much time rehashing this stuff, but I think there's a value in reviewing it and just kind of hammering it in, and maybe there was a strategy there when these steps were structured. Who knows? We'll see. Faith and openness, faith in a higher power, whatever that may be for an individual, is central to this step. Now, again, highlighting what we talked about in the definition of step 2. A higher power for an individual can be, again, the wisdom of the group conscience, or it can be the fellowship of AA itself. It can be... The beauty of it is that this is a subjective experience within the context of definition, right? But it's about being open to guidance and understanding there's something greater than oneself that can provide strength and direction. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was early in recovery, right now, I feel a bit better than I did 6 years ago when I was early in the program. But back then, as far as strength goes, I know that I was exercising all that I had, which is an odd thing, right? Because people say, oh, that must have been taking so much strength for you. I don't know how much it was, but it was all that I had, right? So I guess proportionally it was a lot. If it's everything that you have and you're using all of that at capacity, then sure, I guess in that sense that it would be a lot. The great thing is that once I got to this part of my recovery, once I got to the understanding, or had the understanding, that God could pick up the slack. God's going to take the rest of the brunt of this and bear that himself. And that I wouldn't have to shoulder this. And I never did have to shoulder this burden alone. Of all of the steps in this life, in the program of AA, in any structured system of recovery or progress, I'll tell you that the hardest one, the one that took the most courage for me, was the step toward a higher power, a step toward surrender. That was probably the hardest, but most rewarding. Action of commitment, making a decision to turn one's will and life over, is an active commitment to change. It's not just about recognizing the need for help, but about taking action by consciously deciding to follow a new path, based on faith and trust in that power. Part of what that says to me about me is, for a long time, a lot of these things didn't change because I just talked about it. I talked about a higher power, whether or not I was on an exploration journey, or whether or not I was openly being defiant to God, or whether or not I was just talking that good shit out the side of my neck about having a relationship with God and not really being connected. I was never committed. I never committed to turning my will and my life over to God. I'd never committed to that form of surrender and vulnerability. And I should explain, as I have before, but as it relates to this, like the transcendence or the generalization of the survival skills that I learned or developed as a kid, especially when it comes to trust, those you can see were at play here, right? And the insidious nature of them, and how reptilian brain it is, that I would stick with these survival techniques or these survival defense mechanisms, although I'm not like a stupid alligator. I'm not like a stupid reptile. I can look around in my environment and see the wreckage. I can look around in my life and see the chaos. I can see the tears. I can see the pain. But rather would stick with that than take that one step into something brand new and unknown. It's crazy. But just a couple of ways that step 3 relates to step 2 and some of the overlap: recognition of a higher power. In step 2, we come to believe in a power greater than ourselves that it could restore us to sanity. Step 3 builds on this belief by asking individuals to take the next step and actually turn their lives over to that power, demonstrating a progression from belief to action. Acceptance of personal limitation. We touched on this too, but it's still, is overlapping. I think that it's relevant. Step 2 involved acknowledging that personal efforts alone had failed, right? Our best efforts and best thinking got us to where we were, leading to the belief that help from a higher power is necessary. Language is important. Necessary. Step 3 takes this further by actively deciding to let go of self-reliance and control, fully accepting the need for that external guidance for recovery. Now, I've heard it said many times in a few different ways. I've heard, well, I'm not going to continue to define myself with this disability mindset just because some old dudes a million years ago figured out a system that worked for them and worked for a bunch of other people. But this is 2024, and I'm not going to continue to introduce myself as an alcoholic if I haven't had a drink in 6 years, right? What? Listen, man. I continue to introduce myself as an alcoholic, an addict, when it's appropriate, and I don't feel any shame behind that because I earned those. I put in some years of research first, and then I tested my theory, and it comes back that it's a bigger beast than I can conquer. But I put the time in, and on both ends of this, both opposite sides of the coin, right? On the investment in experience and active addiction and nurturing that, because that's literally what you're doing. You're nurturing a sickness and a disease, albeit unwittingly at first or for however long, and then denial kicks in. But then also on the other side, nurturing that seedling of hope and nurturing and fostering this tiny idea that it's possible that there's space in this world for an alcoholic, an addict like me to carve something out, build some internal systems and some external systems in my life, and accept the guiding power of a higher power. and change all of that shit and live a phenomenally beautiful and powerful life. Now, you can say that's proof of what? That's evidence and proof of what? That hard work, consistency, and living right, like just being a good person, pays off. Yeah, that's proof of that. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. I don't think it's that simple, right? Because I've tried just living without a higher power. I've tried just existing, and I can tell you from my experience, going through all of the motions, that's exactly what I was doing. It was just, I was pantomiming. I was just mimicking it. That's why there was never a connection. I didn't have a connection to a higher consciousness. I didn't have a connection to a higher spiritual source, to a creator, to God. That's why I felt so set apart and marginalized from the experience that I thought largely people in AA and universally in the world were full of shit about. And that's the experience of connecting with God and spirituality. And I'd hear my dad talk about it, heard my mom talk about it at times, some of my siblings, and I'm like, man, y'all are full of shit. Until it happened for me. Now, do I think that it happened for me in the same way that it's happened for them? No, because I don't think that I talk to spirits of people who aren't here anymore. I don't try to communicate in the typical ways that we would, if they were still alive. I keep them in my heart and stuff like that, and I might send some words out into the atmosphere, but I don't look at it the same way that I look at communicating with my kids or with my wife or some friends, right? I don't know that I've heard the voice of God. Some say that the voice of God in your own consciousness is your own voice. Look, man, I don't spend a lot of time digging too far deep into that shit, but I do feel promptings that I think are put on my heart, and I do believe 100% that those come from my higher power, for sure. People call it a conscience, they call it morality, but where does that stuff come from? Okay, the idea of it, like you say, well, we developed it. Okay, but where do ideas come from anyway? Anyway, that's on some whole other like space weirdo shit, but which I'm into too. But you're not gonna make it too far without that kind of surrender and radical acceptance and having faith in higher power. That's step 3. But anyway, if you didn't do it on the way in, think about doing it on the way out. Hit that like, subscribe, and post notification bell so you can stay up to date on all the cool, fun shit we talk about here on that Bees Like That podcast. Peace, y'all.